I'd like to introduce Mr. Mike Jones. And Mike has been involved in the GLAM sector for over a decade. This year, he's working on submitting his PhD at the University of Melbourne and holds a research associate position at Museums Victoria, while continuing to work as an archivist, researcher and freelance collections consultant. In recent years, Mike has also published and presented widely in Australia and internationally. His current positions include membership of the National Executive, the Australasian Association for Digital Humanities, and co-convener of the Victorian branch of the Australian Society of Archivists. Please welcome Mr. Mike Jones.
Thank you. This mic's working okay? Excellent. Hello all, thank you for coming. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank Vala and the conference committee for inviting me along to speak today. And thank you all for coming to this session. I know there are a couple of other really interesting sessions happening at the same time as this, at least one of which I would quite like to be in myself. So I really appreciate you coming along to hear me speak. A thin veneer of immediate reality is spread over nature and artificial matter, and whoever wishes to remain in the now, with the now, on the now, should please not break its tension film. Otherwise, the inexperienced miracle worker will find himself no longer walking on water, but descending upright among staring fish. That's a quote from a short novel by Vladimir Nabokov called Transparent Things, and he's talking about the idea that if we're not careful, we don't remain in the present, we sort of sink into the history of things, and it takes some effort to remain in the present rather than being caught up in memories of the past. But interestingly, in the kind of museum and collection space, it's something which doesn't necessarily strike as much of a chord because things can sometimes be resistant to us understanding them in museums and in archives and in other spaces. And we need additional knowledge, additional support, and we need to capture additional things about objects rather than just preserving the object or the record or the book or the artifact itself. And what I'm going to talk about today is not specifically about tools or technologies. It's not about particular sort of projects. It's some ideas that have emerged from some of my PhD research that I wanted to present to you and get some feedback on the end and just see what people think. And I'm happy to talk later on about some of the practical implications of this sort of work as well. So the idea that we need more from our collections than just an object or just a record is something that goes back quite a long way. To go back to 1784 in London, in a cold December day in London, and a bookseller called William Hutton came down from Birmingham to visit the British Museum. At that point, the British Museum was in Montague House rather than its current location. And you had to book tickets in advance. He was lucky that he got some tickets and met a group of people outside the museum and was being taken through on a tour. And he thought he might be in there for a few hours exploring these kind of wondrous treasures. He was being whipped around the museum by a guide, though, and ended up stopping partway through and said to the guide, "Can you actually tell us something about the things that I'm looking at?" And the guide said, "What, would you have me tell you everything in the museum? How is it possible? Besides, are not the names written upon many of them?" And so within about half an hour, he was whipped through these collections and out the other side. And he said later, "The history and the object must go together. If one's wanting, the other is of little value. I consider myself in the midst of a rich entertainment consisting of 10,000 rarities, but like Tantalus, I could not taste one. It grieved me to think how much I lost for want of a little information. In about 30 minutes, we finished our silent journey through this princely mansion, which would well have taken 30 days. I went out much about as wise as I went in." These kind of calls for more information about collections and better ways of representing the knowledge that exists within collections is something that continues from that point through the 19th century, through the 20th century, picked up again in things like the new museology movement. Peter Virgo in the new museology book from 1989 quotes William Hutton and talks about his visit to the British Museum. And Virgo's article is called The Mute Object. It's about the fact that people do sometimes find some resistance in terms of being able to dig the meaning out from things. So if we're not careful, we see the broad outlines of the shapes in the world, but there's something missing. Now, some of the ways that some of this work is represented in museums, particularly coming out of the natural history side of things, is through hierarchical taxonomies and tree-like diagrams. This is a beautiful illustration of the various kingdoms, which is too big to fit on a single slide, goes all the way up. And it's a hierarchical representation, which is also being carried across in many ways into the ways that artifacts and things are represented. And I threw a quick slide in here after this morning's keynote of the Tim Berners-Lee computer, which you can see has a taxonomy on it that's a kind of hierarchical tree-like taxonomy, which in some ways is relatable to the sort of taxonomy that's used for specimens and natural history. But this sort of tree-like structure has been critiqued for quite a long time in itself. And even as early as the 40s, Alfred Kroeber was writing about the idea that this sort of tree of life doesn't really apply to human culture, and we could extend that into saying it doesn't necessarily apply to collections and the sort of knowledge that's in collections, that these sort of hierarchies and branches going very orderly fashion from a trunk to a branch to a twig to a leaf is far too structured for the real complexity and more of the sort of tangled nature or the entangled nature of what we see in cultural collections. And what Kroeber suggests is the idea of a reef. And a reef contains many different structures. It does contain its hierarchical structures. It contains some kind of tree-like structures, but it also contains different sorts of structures like accumulations and sort of accretions of minerals and animals working together. And these are things that are developed over long periods of time. So these things leave traces and records of the past accumulations that are there, but they're also developed and built upon over periods of time, so it's in development. Some things have been there for hundreds of years, some things are new, so it's in a state of flux, and there are flows moving through these spaces. The sort of calcified structures of reefs can be read a bit like tree rings in that you can see the past history that's there. And Donna Haraway is another who's taken this idea of reefs and talked about it in the sense of culture and collections. She talks about collections of interviews and said that the layered conversations of patterned interviews amongst interlocutors who are distributed in time, space, linguistic commitments, and political yearnings mimic the complex communities of marine organisms whose traffic in sustaining nutrients and meaningful signals tie dispersed members into unquiet webs of polyspecific living tissue. And that idea of polyspecificity, if I can say that word, polyspecificity, the sort of diverse and heterogeneous nature of collections and what that means in terms of documentation is an interesting question to ask when we look at the sorts of systems and descriptive structures that we use. And this, rather than being a kind of taxonomic metaphor, is more of an ecological metaphor. There's a writer who writes a lot about coral reefs called Osher Gray Davidson, who talks about the fact that taxonomy is about drawing lines to kind of limit off things and put things into specific categories to divide them off from the things around them. Whereas an ecological sort of approach is more about drawing lines to connect things up. It's about relationality and interconnection. And these systems link into other systems. Corals link into corals, all linking to the reef, which links into seagrass and mangrove swamps. It's called Braids Within Braids by Davison at one point. And so what we're talking about here in terms of describing collections, if we're using this as a kind of extended metaphor, is that we're not just attempting to describe individual polyps. We're not just attempting to describe individual things in isolation from other things and to divide things off. We're trying to look at these as interconnected kind of systems of a complexity that we can never fully capture, but we need to try and represent this in some more effective kind of way. And it's interesting that part of this is about the description of the context of each thing, and everything is connected into a broader context. And the Latin word for context is associated with ideas like weaving, which connects back to the idea of braids again, and also connects to an object which I want to talk about to step through some of the layers and complexities of collections, which is a rope. So this rope is made from hibiscus fiber, and is made up in the east of Cape York Peninsula, so in far north Queensland. And that sort of area is itself a really rich kind of area of coral reefs and seagrass meadows, a really biodiverse area. The people up on Cape York Peninsula are hunters, and they hunt, among other things, dugong, as well as sea turtles, and get a lot of their food from the sea. And it was collected by Donald Thompson. And Donald Thompson was, he started out as a natural historian. He became an anthropologist, an ethnographic collector. He traveled up to East Cape York Peninsula, and that was one of his first kind of major expeditions. He says it's where he learnt to be an anthropologist. He brought the collection back after his death. The collection, the artifacts are still owned by the University of Melbourne, and they're transferred to Museums Victoria, who manage the collection. And the documentation and the literary estate is still owned by the family, but is also managed by the museum. So he collected other material while he's up there, things like other harpoons. He connected material related to the manufacture of ropes. He collected natural history specimens. This is a dugong skull from up in Cape York Peninsula with one of his handwritten tags on it. He took extensive field notes, and the museum has now about 10,000 pages of foolscap transcribed field notes. They were transcribed over about 15 years or so, which contain information about language and cultural traditions, as well as the natural history of the environment and observations at different times of the environment and the people that Thompson saw when he was traveling, as well as stories about his traveling. His tags that he put on both specimens and natural history items contain cultural information and language, not just specifics about the specimen itself, so it's tying it into these broader kind of areas. He wrote articles as well. This article, The Dugong Hunters of Cape York, shows the way that dugong skeletons and skulls were used as part of burial traditions in that area. And the diagram shows the coiled up dugong rope in the front of the canoe. And the way that this worked is that the harpooner would stand at the front of the canoe, put the harpoon head in a really long shaft, and would wait for or they would chase down a dugong, and the harpooner would dive off the front of the canoe and thrust the harpoon in there, wait for the rope to uncoil. It would drag the canoe behind it, tire the animal out, and then they would subdue it. And they would use all the parts of the animal, from the meat to the oil to the bones, as you can see. He also wrote for the popular press about this, and things like Walkabout, with this amazing cover that's just Australiana personified. Add more koalas and make it more and more Australian. And the other sort of layers and complexities that exist here are the layers of documentation. Documentation itself is not a static thing for collections like this in particular that have been worked on for a long period of time. After many years, this microfiche guide was created to artifacts in the Thompson collection. You can see it contains its own hierarchical structure with hunting and fighting contained within utensils and implements. And within hunting and fighting, we have harpoon equipment, which includes, sorry about the slightly fuzzy slide, but includes an entry for our harpoons and rope. Within the gallery itself, these harpoons and the rope are on display in the working cultures section of the Melbourne Museum at the moment. And there's a digital display there that brings in a whole bunch of other elements to the stories around an object like this, which are the beautiful photographs that Thompson took of this material being manufactured and the ropes being manufactured in Cape York. There's an image of a silver gull there. So there's a story that the rope and its tradition and its manufacture was developed by a being called Katara. And Katara both created a coil of rope that became a rock formation that sits in Temple Bay in the far north of Cape York Peninsula. So this is tying back to country and stories related to country. And that Katara then became a silver gull, tying it into natural history and natural history collections, if we want to keep those sort of divisions in there. So for a single item like this, we can see all of these kind of accretions and accumulations around this as an object. And it's difficult to think of describing this in a single way without some reference to those things. If we look at the way that it's described in the collections online site at the moment, and not a specific critique of Museums Victoria, this is something that happens kind of right across the board. We get some beautiful images of the item, we get a brief description and a physical description. We get some names and references to who collected it and the collection and place, and some links that fire off prepackaged searches or fire off searches that will bring up other things that have the same terms in them. So we don't get a sense from this sort of collection description of this kind of rich accumulation of material and the relationships that it has to published material, to archives, to photographs, to material kept in libraries, and to material in other parts of the museum, including in the natural history collections of the museum, which in themselves are kind of quite separate in the way that the museum is administered. Interestingly, just as a kind of side note, in the microfiche guide, which was published in 1987, we actually get more cross-references than we do in the current online catalogue. These cross-references do exist in the EMU database that's internal to the museum, but it's not publicly accessible. And these cross-references refer to field notebooks, botanical specimens, publications, series of photographs. And it's interesting to think about the way that search works in these cases, where some of these kind of relationships and interconnections between things are potentially considered, for some reason, less necessary, as if search can do everything and we can just use keywords and bring up all the things that we want. Whereas these connections between things have been identified through scholarship and research and through extensive use of the collections, in some cases with consultation with community. So to have those things not publicly accessible as part of the collection description shows the sort of limitations of the discrete collection item. And we can find more relationships. Here are some more between people and organizations and collections and archives and publications. The publication about dugong hunters, for example, the description of Katara and the manufacture of the rope that's used in the current exhibition space comes out of Thompson's article. And there's not a citation on the digital display, but those connections can be identified if you go through that sort of material. And when I started to do that, I had to put this on its side so it would fit on a slide. But this is what the whiteboard in my office looks like at the moment, with the circle in the middle that says DT3324, which is the rope. And this is an attempt to discover this accumulation of material that sits around it. The difficult thing capturing information like this is that the systems that we use to describe and manage our collections don't necessarily facilitate the capture of this sort of information by me, by other researchers, by communities, by people within the museum, which can create some serious problems for the maintenance of this sort of knowledge and people having to potentially repeat a lot of work to find these connections themselves if they want to work with the same material. Now, these sorts of ideas of networks and things, I'm not going to dwell on this slide, and I could have put a huge number of other books on here or a completely different set of books altogether. But just as a kind of reflection of the fact that across a whole bunch of fields, from anthropology to sociology to archaeology to physics and feminist theory, there have been a huge number of theorists through this time and writers through this time who have worked with the idea of entanglement, interconnection, relationality, bundles of relations. These sorts of ideas are not particularly new, but they're not really reflected in the way that we work within collecting institutions and the way we think about the knowledge that we manage. And the sort of metaphors that are used for this are everything from mathematical style network diagrams to notions of the rhizome and roots to start moving away from hierarchical and tree-like structures. And the rhizome being the sort of Deleuze and Guattari notion, trying to get away from the arborescent or the sort of tree-like structure to something that's more of a kind of accumulated lumpen sort of thing, which might be an interesting way to think about collections. People have seen Deb Verhoeven speak before, may be familiar with this slide. This is also thinking about this in terms of humanities knowledge and the way that these interconnections work, moving from data through information, through knowledge to humanities knowledge. And that kind of colorful, heterogeneous knowledge that we see in the humanities end of things, getting us back to these kind of notions of colorful interconnections that exist within reefs and similar structures. So it's a valuable metaphor. There are always limitations to metaphors and limitations to biological metaphors in particular, particularly with notions of life cycle and life and death. But it combines a whole lot of elements that we don't necessarily see in other descriptions of catalogs and collections and their documentation. It's about complexity, and a complexity that's very difficult to capture. It's heterogeneous and polymorphous. It's sort of ecological, but it's also mineralogical. It's constantly changing, but it has some really long-standing structures in it. It's built socially by all sorts of organisms from different sort of parts of the ocean, to continue the metaphor. All sorts of organisms over different times sort of working together, some of them coming from far away, some of them kind of living in the region, and they're all adding and contributing to traces that are left throughout this space. So it's communal and communally developed and ever-changing. And it ties in with ideas that people talk about with web design, and we saw a little bit of user segmentation this morning in the keynote. Some people talking about websites talk about skimmers, swimmers, and divers, of people who sort of quickly pass through a space, people who spend a bit more time, or people who go for a really deep dive into material within websites. Some people have also applied this to collections, and there's a similar one to do with strollers and students, I think, that was used by museum people several years ago. And this is also to not move beyond the fact that with this sort of segmentation, we also need to think about different audiences, and the fact that the communities involved in this, or the communities that this material was collected from, for example, the indigenous communities up on Cape York, need access to this sort of knowledge and information, and potentially different aspects of that information from the information that's required for the people inside the institutions. And so, as people are getting into the diving stage of this, and for researchers who really want to dig into this sort of material, we want to think about more complex ways of describing collections, and ways of describing collections that better reflect the complexity and the diversity of those collections. And if we're not capturing that sort of knowledge over long periods of time, and not capturing that sort of knowledge while people are researching these collections, then there's always the potential that that sort of knowledge will just leach away and we'll end up lesser for it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Now, we have just about 5 minutes just for a couple of questions. So if you do have a question, please just raise your hand, and could you state your name and organisation when asking your question? Who'd like to go first? I can actually make a brief question/comment. I was reminded of when you put up your sideways slide of the famous Knowledge Nation policy of the Australian Labor Party that was created by Barry Jones, and people mocked it and said it looked like spaghetti meatballs.
Yep.
But it actually looked very similar to your tree, and I guess it raised the point that things are complex, that you can't put things in a strict hierarchy or structure. And I guess hearing all of that theory, I'd be interested to know a bit about how we implement that in a practical sense.
Yes. I think some of that is a sort of fundamental level of systems design, where systems used to document things like archives and libraries are often sort of separate within these sort of institutions. It can be really difficult to make links across those type of areas. Some of it is sort of professional traditions around the way that museum collections in particular, and archives and libraries, the way that people have traditionally described things being transferred into a digital kind of space without people reconceptualizing and rethinking the way that those structures can work, when things can exist, for example, within more than one structure at the same time, or more than one place at the same time within a digital sort of space, where hierarchies and things are less important because you don't need to flip through a card catalogue or have books in a certain order on a shelf. They can be in multiple orders simultaneously to capture those sort of different perspectives on things. In my experience looking at a bunch of different museums and collecting institutions, some of this is about organisations not using the full potential of the systems that they've already got. So it's not necessarily about system and technology change. It is about sort of process and people change as much as technological change to support this. But I also think we need to look at the sort of infrastructure that's being built for research. There are projects like Honey that Deb mentioned earlier in the panel session that allow researchers to capture connections between things and then to share those connections with other researchers. So those sorts of projects provide ways that the sort of description that's done within institutions can be kind of supplemented and added to in a communal and community sense, which can start to contribute to some of this space.
And do we have a question or two from the floor? Anyone got a burning question to ask? Yes? Can we get a mic to them? Or can you shout really loud? Or actually, it's all right. We'll wait for the mic. It's coming up. Yep.
Hi, my name's Jeff Barker. I'm from the State Library, New South Wales. I was just wondering if maybe you, in the course of your research, had any thoughts about delivery points and how delivery points for institutions gear how the content is constructed, and in a lot of ways the way it limits the way that people think about content within the institution.
Do you mean delivery points in terms of how this is delivered to the public online via websites, via those sort of
exhibitions, publications, website pages, those sorts of things, yes.
I think there are interesting kind of mismatches in some of those areas in that, to some extent, exhibitions, particularly contemporary exhibitions, tend to do this sort of accumulation and interconnection between things a lot more effectively than we do in a lot of our digital collections and our collection documentation, but it happens for short periods of time. And then when the exhibition is broken up, that knowledge kind of gets broken up and dispersed into research files, into people's research documentation, into exhibition development files, those types of things, rather than it being kind of part of that accumulation. So I think there's kind of two sides to this, well, probably more than two sides, but that some of those delivery points can feed into this because they do identify some of that interconnection and it's where the material's being worked on. Other things like collections online site and the way that search works and the way that people navigate through things with a basic search box, for example, those aspects potentially need to be rethought with this sort of documentation to provide different delivery models so people can follow pathways through things and to follow different kind of pathways through different sorts of collections, and for those pathways themselves to then contribute to the way that these collections are viewed and the way these collections are managed.
Any other quick questions from the audience? Oh, yes, a hand there at the top of the stairs, yes. Oh, yep, if that one's on, go for it.
Oh, hi. I'm Bruce from a community library.
Hi.
I was struck by a couple of things with your talk, particularly how lovely the materials were and the kind of care you've had with them and collecting the imagery from them. But I was also struck by how horrible the sort of the documentation of the exhibition at the museum might be. You know, those little kind of panels where you get an edited paragraph that I personally find terribly unsatisfying. What I was thinking about while you were talking was the gap between the public as a kind of passive consumer of prepared materials and you, the kind of researcher with this kind of privileged access to actually touching the things. And the fact that you're able to get paid to do that. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts sort of about that, the way that we deal with a cultural heritage sort of being locked away in archives for a few, and the potential with a future of people having more time and education to deal with those materials appropriately. Whether you see a path into the future there that's desirable or not?
I think, firstly, while I don't think the collection documentation in gallery is kind of perfect, it's probably better than is represented on the slides here with a couple of static photos. So for people who don't know it, those digital panels within the gallery where you have a case with a huge number of items in it, and you can click on the items on a sort of touchscreen pad, and it will show you some more contextual information about it, some photographs, some other kind of material related to those objects for people who want to explore the detail a bit further. One of the issues with that, though, which sort of starts to go to your point, is that they don't provide significant further pathways beyond that for people who then want to do another layer of exploration or another layer of research, or for people who are interested in different aspects of that or different perspectives on the same thing. They tend to sort of boil things down, like a lot of in-gallery sort of material, to a single kind of either institutional perspective or community or cultural perspective without the two necessarily matching up. In this case, you've got a community perspective, an institutional perspective, an anthropological perspective, and all these things that could be there kind of competing in really productive ways for different ways of looking at the same sorts of material. So I think providing those pathways can be really important, and providing pathways into other material, and thinking about being really generous with our collections data and our collections knowledge, and not just saying, well, putting our collections online is about having digitized items up there with a bit of metadata attached, and it's great, we've now got 1 million of them instead of 500,000. But if we're not conveying that research knowledge about it, and the knowledge that the institutions have, the knowledge that communities have, the knowledge that other users have, if that's not being included as part of that, then the institution is still holding a great deal of authority and kind of power in that relationship, which needs to be seeded, I think, a lot more over time.
And we'll have to leave it there. Could you please thank Mr. Mike Jones one more time?
Thanks.